Hey everyone, welcome back. Today we're going to be doing a deep dive into something called confirmation bias.
Ooh, yeah, this is a good one.
It's one of those things that, you hear the name, you're kind of like, oh, yeah, yeah, I get it. But like when you actually start looking into it, it's so much more complicated and interesting.
Yeah, totally. There's so much to unpack.
And we've got some really interesting sources on this one. Academic papers, we've got psychology reviews, we've even got a stock market study on confirmation bias, which I'm very excited about.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that sounds fascinating.
Yeah, so we've got a lot to cover. Um, so before we get into all that good stuff, can you just give us a clear definition of confirmation bias? Like, what exactly are we talking about here?
So, confirmation bias is basically like this tendency to look for and interpret information in a way that confirms your pre-existing beliefs.
Okay, so it's like if you already believe something, you're more likely to kind of notice and pay attention to things that support that belief, and you're more likely to kind of ignore or downplay things that go against it.
Exactly. And it can even go further than that. Like, you might even interpret ambiguous information in a way that fits your existing belief, even if it could be interpreted in a totally different way.
Ooh. That's kind of scary when you think about it. Like,
Yeah.
are we all just walking around misinterpreting everything to fit our own little worldviews?
Well, it's not always that dramatic, but it definitely can have a big impact on how we see the world and make decisions. And the thing is, it's not always a conscious thing. A lot of this happens subconsciously without us even realizing it.
Okay, so it's not like people are deliberately trying to be biased. It's like a built-in feature of how our brains work.
Exactly. And there's actually a ton of research that shows this, like going all the way back to the mid-20th century.
Oh, wow. So this isn't like some new agey concept. It's been studied for decades.
Oh, yeah, yeah. Like one of the early studies that really like shed light on this was done back in 1956 by these guys, Bruner, Goodnow, and Austin. They were studying how people form concepts, and they noticed that people tended to test their ideas in a way that was kind of biased towards confirmation.
Okay, so like, how did that actually play out in their research?
So they used this example of a small red circle, and participants had to figure out what the concept was. Like, was it about the size, the color, the shape, some combination of those things?
Okay, yeah, yeah, I see.
And what they found was that instead of systematically testing different possibilities, people often got stuck in this loop of just testing examples that fit their initial hunch.
So like if they thought it was about the color red,
Hmm.
they would just keep testing red things and they wouldn't think to test blue things or green things to see if that also fit.
Yeah, exactly. And they might miss out on the actual concept because they were so focused on confirming their initial idea. They called this hypothesis testing, and it showed up in a lot of their research.
Hypothesis testing. It's like we're all mini scientists, but we're not very good at designing unbiased experiments.
Uh-huh. Yeah, kind of. And this whole confirmation seeking thing, it shows up in other research too. Like there's this classic study by Peter Wasson in 1960 that uses these number triplets.
Oh yeah, the 2-4-6 task. I remember reading about that one.
That's the one. So in this task, participants are given the sequence 246, and they have to figure out the rule that generated it. Sounds simple enough, right?
Yeah, you'd think so. But I'm guessing it's not as easy as it seems.
Not really. See, what happens is people often come up with a hypothesis like the numbers are increasing by 2, and then they only test sequences that fit that rule. So they'll be like, okay, what about 8, 10, 12, or 14, 16, 18, and so on.
Oh, so they're not trying to like disprove their rule.
Uh-huh.
They're not trying to like, come up with a sequence that wouldn't fit that rule and see if it gets rejected.
Exactly. They're so focused on being right that they miss opportunities to actually test their understanding. And what Wasson found was that people were way more likely to confirm their hypothesis than to try to disprove it, even though disproving it would be much more informative.
Hmm. Yeah, that makes sense. I guess it's kind of like more satisfying to be right than to be wrong, even if being wrong actually teaches you more in the long run.
Yeah, totally. And it highlights this really important point about how we gather information, this idea of like diagnosticity. Basically, how much an observation actually tells us about the truth of a hypothesis.
Diagnosticity, huh? That sounds kind of technical. Can you break that down for us a bit more?
Okay, so think of it this way. Truly informative observations, like the ones that really help us learn, they shouldn't just support our idea, they should also rule out other possibilities.
Okay, yeah, yeah.
Like, if an observation could be true under multiple different scenarios, it's not very helpful in figuring out which one is actually correct. It's like, a detective finding a fingerprint at a crime scene, but it could belong to anyone. Not very helpful.
Uh-huh. Yeah, that's a good analogy.
So, in the case of the number triplets, if you just keep testing sequences that fit your rule of increasing by 2, you're not really learning anything new. But if you test a sequence that doesn't fit that rule, like 357, and it gets rejected, then that tells you something. It narrows down the possibilities and helps you get closer to the actual rule.
Okay, so it's not enough to just find evidence that supports your idea. You also need to actively look for evidence that could disprove it. That's how you actually get to the truth of the matter.
Exactly. And that's where confirmation bias often leads us astray. Instead of seeking out a balanced view of the evidence, we tend to focus on the stuff that reinforces what we already believe, even if it's not the most reliable or informative stuff.
So we've seen how this bias plays out in these kind of controlled experimental settings. But how about in real life? Like beyond guessing number rules or abstract concepts, how does this bias actually affect us in our everyday lives?
Oh, well, that's where it gets really interesting and maybe a bit unnerving. Because the thing is, confirmation bias isn't just confined to the lab, it affects us in all sorts of practical ways, shaping how we see the world, make decisions, interact with others. It's everywhere.
Ooh, okay, now you've got me really intrigued.
Hmm.
So how about we unpack some real-world examples of this? Like, let's see how this bias plays out in situations we can all relate to.
All right, I like it. Let's do it. All right, so think about those times you get in those like heated debates online. Maybe it's about like a political issue or something. Were you like actually open to hearing the other side's arguments, or were you just kind of like digging your heels in and looking for stuff that just backed up your own view?
Oh, man, yeah. I've definitely been there, like, especially online. It's so easy to get caught in that trap. It's like everyone's just throwing out opinions and articles and stuff that, like, confirms what they already believe, and it's like you just get sucked into this echo chamber.
Exactly. And that's like a prime example of confirmation bias in action. It's like we surround ourselves with this information that just reinforces our existing beliefs, and it makes us feel even more certain that we're right, even if, we might not be.
Yeah, and it's not just online either, right? Like, I feel like this happens in real life too, all the time.
Oh, totally. Yeah. Like, think about how we judge other people's behavior. Have you ever noticed how, like, the same action can be seen as, like, totally different depending on who's doing it?
Oh, yeah, for sure. Like, if it's someone I like, I might be like, "Oh, that's so funny," or "That's kinda cute." But if it's someone I don't like, I might be like, "Ugh, that's so annoying," or "That just proves my point."
Right. And that's confirmation bias shaping our perceptions. We're more likely to excuse or downplay bad behavior from people we like, and we're more likely to focus on and judge bad behavior from people we don't like.
Hmm.
And it's not just about like personal opinions either. This can have like really big impacts in professional settings too. Like there was this study by Moskowitz and Carter back in 2014 that found that like pre-existing stereotypes about black athletes can actually influence how their actions are interpreted.
Oh, wow. So it's like if a black athlete shows confidence or celebrates a win, it might be seen as arrogance, whereas if a white athlete does the same thing, it might be seen as leadership.
Exactly, yeah. And this can happen in other areas too, like in the workplace. Like a black man expressing his opinion might be seen as aggressive, while a white man doing the same thing might be seen as assertive. It's these subtle, like, interpretations that can have a huge impact on people's lives.
It's really kind of disturbing when you think about it. Like, how many of our judgments about other people are actually objective versus how many are just, like, influenced by our own biases?
It's a constant challenge for sure. And it's not just about like how we judge others, it also affects our own decision making. Like think about medical diagnoses, for example. Doctors, like even with all their training and experience, they're not immune to confirmation bias.
Oh, yeah. I was reading about a study where doctors had trouble changing their initial diagnosis even when, like, tests came back that contradicted it.
Yeah, exactly. They were so attached to their initial hypothesis that they basically ignored or downplayed the evidence that didn't fit. And this isn't like a new thing either. There are all sorts of historical examples of this same kind of bias in medicine where, doctors would stick with treatments that didn't work or they would misinterpret patient outcomes because they were only focusing on the cases that supported their beliefs.
So it's like even in fields where you would think objectivity is super important, like this bias can still like creep in and cloud people's judgment.
Oh, yeah, for sure. And it's not just limited to like complicated fields like medicine either. Think
Yeah.
about something like investing. Like, say you decide to buy a certain stock and you start looking for information to like justify your decision. Suddenly, every like positive news article you read feels like, oh, yeah, this confirms it. And you might just like ignore those warning signs or negative reports.
Yeah, totally. Like you get so excited about your investment that you become blind to anything that suggests maybe it wasn't the best idea.
Yeah, and that can be like a really big problem in the financial world. There's actually this really interesting study by Park and some other researchers back in 2010, and they looked at investor behavior on these online stock message boards.
Okay, interesting. And what did they find?
Well, they found that investors who had like a strong confirmation bias, the ones who were really actively seeking out information that just confirmed their beliefs, those investors actually traded more often, but they made less money.
Wow. So like being overconfident because you're only seeing the evidence that supports your choices can actually lead to worse outcomes.
It's kind of counterintuitive, but yeah, that's what they found. And it's a great example of how this bias can have like real world consequences. It's not just about like our thoughts, it's about our actions too. And this actually ties back to something that Kahneman and Tversky talked about back in like the 70s. You know those guys?
Yeah, yeah, I've heard of them. But what was that concept they talked about? Yeah.
Oh, they called it the illusion of validity. It's this idea that people tend to overestimate how accurate their judgments and predictions are, especially when they have like a lot of information that seems to support those judgments.
Oh, interesting. So it's like we think we're right even when we're not because we've convinced ourselves with all this like biased information.
Exactly. And that can be really dangerous. It can lead to like bad decisions in all sorts of areas, from finance to hiring to even military strategy.
Wow. So this bias can literally affect decisions that have like life or death consequences.
Yeah, it's kind of scary when you think about it. But, the first step to like dealing with this is just being aware of it, like understanding how confirmation bias works and the situations where it's most likely to like trip us up.
Okay, so we've established that confirmation bias is basically everywhere, affecting everything from our personal opinions to our professional decisions. But I got to ask, is it always a bad thing? Like, are there any situations where this whole, like, confirmation-seeking tendency might actually be helpful or beneficial?
That's a really good question. And it's actually one that researchers have been kind of debating for a while. Like, it's easy to just see confirmation bias as this purely negative force, but it's probably more complicated than that.
So you're saying there might actually be some upsides to this seemingly irrational behavior. Tell me more.
Well, think about it from an evolutionary perspective. Like, imagine you're part of this small tribe living in a dangerous environment. You don't have like a lot of information and you have to make quick decisions to survive. In that context, having a strong bias towards just confirming what you already believe, especially if those beliefs have kept you alive so far, that might actually be a pretty good strategy.
Oh, interesting. So like in that situation, sticking to your guns, even if your beliefs aren't totally accurate, might actually increase your chances of survival.
Exactly. And this also kind of ties into the whole idea of like social cohesion. If everyone in the tribe kind of shares the same basic beliefs and values, it can promote unity and cooperation, which are pretty essential for survival.
Yeah, that makes sense. So it's like confirmation bias might actually be a kind of like social glue that helps groups stick together and function effectively.
Yeah, something like that. Of course, that doesn't mean we should just blindly accept everything we hear or reject all new information. But it does suggest that confirmation bias might not be this totally negative force.
That's a really fascinating perspective. It's almost like this bias is a bit like fire, you know? It can
Mhm.
be really destructive if it's not controlled, but it can also be incredibly useful when it's harnessed properly.
I like that analogy. And understanding its complexity, both the good and the bad, that's really important for navigating the world effectively. We need to be aware of when it's going to trip us up, but also recognize that it might have played a role in like shaping our social structures and even like our own cognitive abilities.
Wow, this has been super insightful. I'm already starting to see the world differently, like more aware of how my own biases might be shaping my views and my decisions. But okay, let's get practical here. Like, what can we actually do to like mitigate the negative effects of confirmation bias and become more objective thinkers?
Yeah, that's the big question, right? Like, how do we actually combat this thing? But the good news is that even though it's like a really powerful force, it's not unbeatable. We can totally learn to manage it and make more, conscious and objective choices.
Okay, so it's not about like completely rewiring our brains. It's more about like developing strategies to kind of counter this natural tendency.
Exactly. It's like building mental muscles, to help us resist those like biased impulses.
Yeah.
And one of the like most powerful tools we have is just actively seeking out diverse perspectives. Like instead of just surrounding ourselves with people who agree with us all the time, we should make an effort to, engage with folks who have different viewpoints.
So basically step out of those echo chambers we were talking about and actually like expose ourselves to different ways of thinking. I can see how that will be helpful, but it also sounds kind of intimidating.
Yeah, it can be. But, it's often in those like uncomfortable conversations, the ones where our beliefs are actually challenged, that's where the real growth happens.
Yeah.
And it's not about like trying to win the argument or change anyone's mind. It's more about just like exposing ourselves to different ways of thinking, different interpretations of the same evidence.
It's like that saying, iron sharpens iron.
Yeah.
Like we need that friction of different ideas to actually like sharpen our own thinking.
Exactly. It forces us to actually examine our assumptions, like why do I believe this? Where did this belief come from? And sometimes that can lead us to actually like change our minds or at least become more nuanced in our views.
Yeah, that makes sense. But let's be real, like sometimes those conversations can get pretty heated, especially online. How do we like engage with those different viewpoints
Mm.
without getting sucked into these like unproductive arguments where everyone's just, yelling at each other and not actually listening?
Yeah, that's a really good point. And I think that's where this idea of intellectual humility comes in, like being able to recognize that we don't have all the answers, that we might be wrong, and that the other person might actually have something valuable to teach us, even if we don't agree with them.
So it's more about like going into those conversations with a sense of curiosity and openness rather than defensiveness.
Exactly. Asking clarifying questions, like really listening to what the other person is saying, trying to understand their perspective, even if we don't agree with it.
Yeah.
And if things start to get like too heated, maybe it's time to just, take a step back, disengage before it turns into a shouting match.
Like choosing your battles,
Yeah.
you know, focusing on the conversations where there's actually like a chance for a real dialogue.
Exactly. And this doesn't mean we have to like tolerate hate speech or anything like that. We can definitely set boundaries and disengage from conversations that are just like unproductive or disrespectful. But if we approach those disagreements with a spirit of curiosity and a willingness to learn, we might be surprised by what we discover.
Yeah, I love that. Okay, so seeking out diverse perspectives and engaging with them thoughtfully, that's one tool. What other strategies can we use to like combat confirmation bias in our daily lives?
Okay, so another really powerful technique is to kind of get in the habit of playing devil's advocate, even with our own beliefs.
Oh, I like that. So it's like intentionally challenging our own assumptions, looking for evidence that might actually contradict what we believe, even if it makes us uncomfortable.
Exactly. It's like putting our own ideas on trial, forcing ourselves to consider alternative explanations. Like we're playing the role of the opposing counsel in our own mental courtroom.
Uh-huh. I love that visual. So instead of just accepting the first thought that pops into our heads, we pause and we ask, okay, what if I'm wrong? What are some other possible explanations for this?
Precisely. And it's not about trying to like prove ourselves wrong. It's more about just exploring those alternative perspectives, those pieces of evidence that we might have like unconsciously filtered out because they didn't fit our initial narrative.
It's like we're being our own fact checkers,
Yeah.
scrutinizing our own thinking with the same rigor that we might apply to someone else's argument.
Exactly. And this can be so helpful in all sorts of situations, from like reading news articles to making big decisions to even just navigating personal relationships. It helps us to be more critical thinkers and avoid those like impulsive decisions that we might regret later.
Yeah, that's great advice.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've got seeking out diverse perspectives, playing devil's advocate. Anything else we can add to this confirmation bias busting toolkit?
Okay, here's a big one, and it might sound obvious, but it's really important. Focus on facts and evidence, not just opinions and emotions. It's so easy to get swept up in those like really emotionally charged arguments or those charismatic personalities who seem so sure of themselves.
Oh, tell me about it,
Yeah.
especially in this age of social media where everyone's got an opinion and a platform to share it on.
Right. And that's why it's more important than ever to develop those like critical thinking skills. To pause and ask ourselves, like, okay, what's the actual evidence for this claim? Is this information coming from a reliable source? Am I letting my own biases influence how I'm interpreting this?
So it's about separating the fact-based arguments from the opinion-based arguments,
No.
recognizing that just because someone speaks with conviction doesn't mean they're actually right.
Exactly. And being aware of the potential biases of our sources, too. Like,
Hmm.
is this news outlet known for having a certain slant? Does this expert have a vested interest in a particular outcome?
It's like we have to become detectives,
Hmm.
you know, not just accepting information at face value, but actually investigating the source, the evidence, and our own potential biases and how we're interpreting it all.
Exactly. And maybe the most important thing of all is being willing to change our minds when we're presented with, like, compelling evidence, even if it means admitting that we were wrong.
Ooh, yeah, that's a tough one. No one likes to admit they were wrong, especially if they've been, like, really vocal about their beliefs.
Yeah, it can be really challenging, but it's also a sign of, like, intellectual growth and maturity. It's about prioritizing truth over ego, recognizing that our beliefs aren't these, like, fixed things. They can and should evolve as we learn and grow.
It's like that quote from John Maynard Keynes, "When the facts change, I change my mind. What do you do, sir?"
Haha, exactly. And that willingness to adapt, to embrace that intellectual humility, that's a key part of being a critical thinker.
Awesome. So we've got a whole toolbox of strategies now. Seeking diverse perspectives, playing devil's advocate, focusing on facts and evidence, being willing to change our minds. But it sounds like overcoming confirmation bias is like a constant process, not a one-time fix.
Absolutely. It's a lifelong journey of, like, self-awareness and self-reflection. It's about constantly questioning our assumptions, examining our biases, and just striving to be more objective in our thinking. And the cool thing is that this journey not only makes us, like, better thinkers, but it also makes us more responsible citizens. We're better equipped to navigate this crazy world we live in.
That's a great point. It's not just about personal growth, it's about contributing to a more informed and reasoned public discourse, especially in these times of like information overload and political polarization.
Exactly. The more we understand about how our minds work, how our biases can, like, trip us up, the better we'll be able to have those important conversations, find common ground, and make decisions that are actually good for everyone, not just ourselves.
I think you've given our listeners a ton of great advice and some really valuable tools to start, like tackling this confirmation bias thing. Any final thoughts on the future of like research and application in this area? Where do you see all this going?
You know, one area that I'm really excited about is this idea of personalized debiasing interventions. Like, what if we could actually tailor strategies to individual thinking styles and the situations where they're most vulnerable to confirmation bias?
So it's like personalized medicine, but for our minds.
Exactly. By understanding how this bias works differently in different people, we can come up with more targeted and effective approaches. We could even imagine incorporating these insights into, like, educational programs, teaching kids critical thinking skills from a young age.
Wow, that would be amazing. What other areas are you like eager to see explored?
I'm also really interested in how technology can both, like, amplify and mitigate confirmation bias. We've talked about those filter bubbles and echo chambers online, but I also think that technology can be used to, like, expose us to diverse perspectives and challenge our assumptions.
Yeah, totally. So it's about being more intentional with how we use technology, designing algorithms that promote diverse content, fact-checking tools that help us evaluate information, and platforms that actually encourage respectful dialogue.
Exactly. And I think this kind of, like, interdisciplinary approach where we're combining insights from psychology and technology and even, like, behavioral economics, that's going to lead to some really groundbreaking discoveries in the years to come. Imagine a world where we're not just aware of our biases, but we actually have the tools and the technology to counter them effectively, to make better decisions, and to create a more just and equitable society.
Wow, that's a powerful vision. I'm definitely feeling hopeful about the future of critical thinking. Well, it looks like we've reached the end of our deep dive into confirmation bias. We've explored the research, unpacked the implications, and hopefully given you some practical strategies to start overcoming this really pervasive bias.
And remember, this is just the beginning. Keep questioning, keep exploring, keep that curiosity alive.
Couldn't have said it better myself. So, until next time, everyone, keep diving deep and stay curious.